The evening hum of Camden Market filled the warm summer air, strings of fairy lights swaying above food stalls, the scent of roasted chestnuts and buttery crepes curling through the air, and the chatter of locals weaving through laughter and music. Among the noise and color strolled James Rowe, a man who, at a glance, looked like he didn't belong. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered of boardrooms and billion-pound deals, James wasn't there for the street food or the charm. He was just killing time after another long meeting, trying to remember what it felt like to be ordinary. It had been years since he let himself slow down. At 38, he was one of the most sought-after names in British tech, the CEO of a global software firm. But success had its cost. He was alone, emotionally armored, and untouched by anything he couldn't measure in numbers. And yet, that night, something unexpected cracked the shell he'd so carefully built. He'd just ordered a plain vanilla cone from a modest ice cream cart when a small girl appeared beside him. Her curls were wild, her coat too thin for the evening chill, and her trainers didn't match. Still, it wasn't her appearance that stopped James in his tracks. It was her eyes. Calm, direct, impossibly wise. As he knelt to offer her some spare change, she gently shook her head. "I don't need money," she said softly. "I just want a hug, like the kind your daughter gets." The words struck him like cold air to the lungs. "I don't have a daughter," he replied, stunned. "I don't have a dad," she said just as matter of fact. "Never had a proper hug from one. I just want to know what that feels like." In that moment, the market sounds fell away. James saw himself, not the man he was now, but the little boy he once was, standing in the grand empty hallway of his father's Surrey estate, waiting for a hug that never came. Without thinking, he opened his arms, and the little girl Lily stepped right into them. That hug lasted only a minute, maybe two, but it began something neither of them would forget. Behind her, a cautious mother named Beth watched with narrowed eyes but said nothing, just observed quietly, reading the man holding her child not with suspicion, but curiosity. Something about him didn't feel threatening. Something about him felt sad. That one small act, a hug from a stranger, would go on to change all their lives. Because sometimes what someone needs most isn't money or advice, it's simply someone willing to stay. James hadn't planned to return to the market. Not really. But some things linger. Certain words, certain looks, and Lily's voice stayed with him like a quiet echo in a grand empty room. "I just want a hug." It repeated itself every time he stepped into his penthouse flat, every time he took a sip of whiskey or answered another cold-clipped email. That tiny girl with fire in her eyes and pain far too old for her years had opened something he didn't know still existed in him. So the following weekend, dressed more like a local than a CEO, dark jeans, rolled sleeves, trainers he hadn't worn in months, James returned to Camden Market. He wasn't even sure what he was hoping for. Maybe to see her again. Maybe to understand why that moment had undone him so completely. He spotted them near the far end of the market, a modest table set up beneath a fluttering bunting of paper lanterns, scattered with handmade trinkets, woven bracelets, key rings stitched from felt, watercolor bookmarks with soft, childlike illustrations. Behind it stood the woman from that night. She was in a simple wool jumper and jeans, her blonde hair tied back, hands busy adjusting displays. She looked tired, but not defeated, strong in the way only mothers forced to carry more than their share of weight become strong. Next to her sat Lily, coloring quietly, a stubby crayon gripped tightly in her small hand. James approached slowly. "Hi," he said. Lily looked up first. Her face broke into a grin. "It's the ice cream man!" she squealed. James chuckled despite himself. "Close enough." The woman turned at the sound. Her eyes widened just slightly. There was no fear, no alarm, just wary recognition. "I'm James," he said gently, offering a tentative hand. "Beth," she replied after a moment, shaking it briefly. "And I think you've already met Lily." They exchanged a few polite words. James complimented the craftwork. Beth gave him prices in the straightforward way of someone not interested in flattery. He bought a bracelet, sky blue, stitched with silver thread, and handed Lily a coloring set he'd picked up earlier that day. Beth said nothing, but her eyes lingered on him a little longer, a little softer. Over the next few weeks, James found himself drawn back to the market more often, always to their table. He came with simple things, warm pastries, second-hand books, a scarf in Lily's favorite color. He never stayed too long, he never made it awkward, and he never made it feel like charity. Beth never asked for anything, never expected thanks, but she began offering tea in paper cups and stories about Lily's latest mischiefs, and James listened. Really listened. It became a quiet ritual. Friday evenings, the three of them sharing space under hanging lights and the scent of sizzling food. Lily would chatter and draw, always the same image in different forms. 3 stick figures beneath a roof, one tall, one medium, one small, always under a big yellow sun. One night, she pointed at the tallest one and said, "That's you." James felt his throat catch. He learned that Beth had once studied illustration, dreamt of illustrating children's books. "Didn't quite go to plan," she said with a small shrug. "Lily came along. It was just the two of us from the start." She worked evenings at a cafe and sold crafts on weekends to make ends meet. James admired her grit, her refusal to complain, to pity herself. She wasn't ashamed, just tired and proud. Still, Beth held her boundaries close. One night, when he handed her a warm dinner wrapped in foil, she quietly slipped a tenner into his coat pocket. "I don't take favors," she said. "You didn't ask for any," he replied. "This isn't a favor. This is me being around." One rainy evening, James found them huddled under a bus shelter. Lily had a fever. Beth was pale with worry. The clinic had no room. Without hesitating, James bundled them into his car and drove straight to Andy. He paced the corridor like it was his own child behind that curtain. When Lily finally drifted to sleep in the hospital bed, her tiny hand curled around his finger, Beth didn't stop him. She just sat across from him, silent, watching. After that night, something shifted. Beth didn't smile more, but she looked at him longer. And when Lily called him Mr. Warm, after the hugs and meals and coloring pens, it stuck. Even Beth didn't correct her. James stopped checking his phone so much. He stopped thinking about his next merger, his next deal. He started thinking about birthdays, bedtime stories, and whether he could build a shed for Beth's art studio. One night, under a canopy of fairy lights in their small back garden, Beth turned to him and said, "I'm afraid to let you in. If you go, I won't know how to explain it to her." James looked back, steady and calm. "I'm not going," he said. "I'm here because I want to be." And slowly, piece by piece, Beth began to believe him. Not because he said the right things, but because he stayed. He stayed through fevers, school projects, forgotten birthdays, and long, quiet evenings. He showed up not to rescue, but to belong. Because sometimes love isn't about falling. Sometimes it's about staying. It was late October when the nights turned crisp and the leaves in the park near Beth's flat began to burn orange and gold. James had become a quiet fixture in their lives now, never demanding, never overstepping. He showed up with a bag of groceries, a warm dinner, sometimes just a gentle smile, and always a willingness to listen. That Saturday, they sat on a bench near the swings while Lily chased leaves with a stick and her ever-present stuffed rabbit. Beth sipped from a takeaway coffee cup, her fingers wrapped tightly around it, though the drink had gone cold. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that settles between two people who have learned to trust in the quiet. Then, in a moment that surprised them both, James spoke. "I never really had a dad," he said simply, his voice low, gaze fixed on a pair of children kicking a football in the distance. Beth didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Encouraged, James went on. "I mean, technically I did, but he was always working, always chasing the next deal, flying to Singapore, Brussels, wherever, never home, never at school plays, never once picked me up or hugged me goodnight." His voice caught slightly. "I used to pretend it didn't matter, that I was too old for all that. But the truth is I would have given anything just to be picked up from school like the other kids." Beth looked down at her hands. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said softly, "That makes 2 of us." James turned to her. She didn't elaborate right away. Instead, her eyes wandered toward Lily, who was now trying to balance on the edge of the sandbox. "My dad left when I was 9, she continued, her voice steady but distant. No note, no explanation, just vanished. My mom tried her best, but..." She gave a small shrug. "It's a strange thing growing up with someone who's supposed to protect you, then realizing they never meant to stay." James nodded slowly. The ache in their stories wasn't identical, but it ran parallel. Two people raised on absence, still learning how to give the very thing they never received. Beth went quiet again. Her guard was always up, her smile always a little cautious. But that afternoon, as the wind rustled through the trees and Lily's laughter echoed in the background, something shifted. She didn't look at James like a man passing through anymore. She looked at him like someone who might actually stay. The following weekend, rain pelted down in sheets. Beth didn't open her stall at the market, but James came anyway. He waited at the corner near the usual spot, umbrella in hand. He wasn't sure what for. Habit? Hope? Then across the street at the bus shelter, he spotted them. Beth sitting on the bench, cradling Lily, who looked pale and feverish. Without a word, he crossed over. "She's burning up," Beth said quickly, panic cracking her voice. "The clinic's full and I—" "Come with me," James interrupted. "My car's right here." They didn't argue. He drove like it was his own child in the back seat, windshield wipers thumping madly. At the hospital, James stayed close. He paced while Beth filled out forms, fetched water, offered tissues. When Lily was finally tucked into a hospital bed, a tiny IV in her arm, James sat by her side. He took her hand gently and began to speak. Not about business, not about news, but about a princess who turned sadness into stars, and a knight who couldn't fight, but could always listen. He made the story up as he went, voice low, steady, filled with warmth. Beth sat across the bed, silently watching. She didn't stop him. She didn't need to. Long past midnight, Lily drifted to sleep. Still, James didn't move. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look at the clock. He just stayed, one hand gently cradling Lily's, the other resting on the edge of the bed. Beth looked at him with something new in her eyes. Not gratitude, not debt, something deeper, something like trust. From then on, there was no denying James had become part of their world. It happened gradually, like sunlight warming a cold room. He was there for the small things, Sunday breakfasts, school pickups, trips to the charity shop. Lily called him Mr. Warm because, as she said with perfect sincerity, he always brings warm food and warm hugs and his eyes smile. Beth laughed when she heard it, but she didn't correct her. James had changed too. He stopped working late into the night. He began spending evenings helping Lily with her spelling or standing in the kitchen trying, and often failing, to master Beth's shepherd's pie. He stopped measuring his days by deadlines and began measuring them by laughter, by quiet moments, by the feeling of belonging somewhere for the first time in his life. He never tried to take over. He never made promises he couldn't keep, but he stayed. And over time, Beth stopped flinching when he knocked at the door. She started leaving a third plate out for dinner. She started letting him in, not just into her home, but into her life. And James? For the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. He was learning, one slow evening at a time, what it meant to love not with words, but with presence. Not to fix someone's life, but to be part of it. Not to rescue, but to remain. Because sometimes the most extraordinary love story begins with the quietest words, "I'll stay." James had returned to the night market like clockwork, always with a small gift or gesture, never flashy, never forced. A box of coloring pens here, a warm meal wrapped in foil there. But more than that, he came with time, with attention, with a quiet sincerity that didn't need explaining. And though Beth never asked for help, never leaned too much into his kindness, over the weeks, she started to let herself exhale when she saw him approaching. It was subtle at first, her posture softening, her eyes lingering a second longer, her voice losing the edge it often wore like armor. And Lena, of course, was always delighted, calling him Mr. Warm, with the glee only a child's heart could offer. One late afternoon, as the market began to wind down and the golden light filtered between the paper lanterns above, James lingered by Beth's table, helping her fold the last of the embroidered cloths and stack the handmade notebooks. Lena sat cross-legged nearby, doodling suns and hearts and stick figures. Her world was still small, but it was growing more colorful. James glanced down at the bracelets Beth had crafted, delicate patterns of thread and color, and his curiosity finally got the better of him. "Did you always make these?" he asked. Beth didn't look up as she tightened a knot. "I used to draw," she said simply. "Studied illustration once, children's books, that sort of thing." James watched her fingers work, strong, precise, practiced. "What happened?" he asked gently. She shrugged. "Life. College didn't last. Lena came early, came alone." There was no bitterness in her tone, no self-pity, just fact. James didn't speak immediately. He knew not to fill the silence too quickly. Beth added, still threading, "I work at a diner some nights. This stall helps fill the gaps." He nodded slowly, absorbing the quiet strength in her words. She wasn't hiding her struggle, nor parading it. She owned it. Every cracked edge, every patch she'd sewn together with tired hands and unrelenting love. He thought of all the women he'd met in boardrooms and ballrooms, polished, styled, curated within an inch of their lives, and yet none of them carried the kind of power Beth did. Her beauty wasn't in designer shoes or red lips. It was in the way she never gave up, even when no one was watching. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked finally. Beth paused, glanced toward Lena, who was now humming to herself while adding stars to her sketch. Then she smiled, a small private thing. "As long as she keeps smiling, I don't get tired." James felt those words land deep, deeper than anything he could recall hearing in years. They stayed with him that night and the next, long after he'd left the market. He thought of his own mother, poised and distant, her presence always carefully timed between charity events and club lunches. She had never known this kind of strength, and perhaps in truth, neither had he. But he wanted to, so he came back again and again. At first on weekends, then even on quiet weekdays. He stopped calling it checking in and started calling it what it really was, being there. The three of them shared simple things: grilled corn from a nearby stall, quiet conversations over folding tables, children's books read aloud as the market closed. Lena always in the middle, drawing, dreaming, reminding them both how to believe in softness again. One evening, after the crowds had thinned and lanterns flickered low, Lena held up a new drawing. This one had 3 figures under a big yellow sun, one tall, one medium, and one small. "This is our house," she declared proudly. "There's Mummy and me and the vanilla ice cream man." James laughed softly, but when he looked at Beth, she wasn't laughing. She was staring at the picture, her fingers still on the edge of the table, her knuckles slightly white. She didn't speak of it then, but James saw the way she looked away, saw the fear hiding beneath the silence. It wasn't fear of him, it was fear of hope, of letting herself believe in something that might not last, because people like her weren't often chosen. They were admired, perhaps pitied, occasionally helped, but rarely stayed for. And yet there was James, again and again, not with promises, but with presence. Later that night, as they sat on the curb eating takeaway noodles, James finally broke the quiet. "I'm not buying you dinner," he said gently. Beth glanced at him, brow raised slightly. He continued, "I'm not buying your time or Lena's laughter or the space you've let me into. I'm not keeping a tally. I'm not here because I owe something or expect something. I'm here because I want to be." Beth didn't answer right away. She looked over at Lena, who was now falling asleep, her head on James's jacket bundled like a pillow. Then she turned back to him. "Most people don't stay," she said quietly. "I know," James replied. "That's why I'm trying to show you I'm not most people." She didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. But she reached for her daughter's hand and held it tightly as if grounding herself. James didn't push the moment further. He didn't reach for her hand or make a move. He simply stayed, sitting beside her, as the wind whispered through the leaves and the lanterns above swayed gently in the breeze. Because sometimes love isn't loud or immediate. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and slow-burning. And sometimes the greatest act of love is simply staying, especially when you know the other person has been left too many times before. Certainly. Based on summary number 5, here is a 700-900 word continuation where James quietly deepens his role in Beth and Lena's lives, offering care and stability in ways he never imagined himself capable of, especially when an emergency forces him to act without hesitation. The rain came down in sheets that Saturday night, relentless and cold. The night market was quiet, most stalls shuttered early, The usual chatter of the crowd replaced by the soft patter of water against canvas awnings. James stood near the familiar corner, umbrella in hand, scanning the thinning streets. He knew Beth didn't open the stall in weather like this, but something gnawed at him, something instinctual, a feeling that he was supposed to be there tonight. Then he saw them, huddled under a small bus shelter at the far end of the street. Beth sat with Lena curled in her lap. Even from the distance, James could tell something was wrong. Beth's face, usually composed, was taut with worry. He moved quickly, crossing the street as water splashed up from the pavement. "Beth," he called gently. She looked up, startled, eyes wide and strained. "She's burning up," she said quickly, brushing damp hair from Lena's flushed forehead. "I tried the clinic, but it's full. They said to come back tomorrow." James didn't hesitate. "Come with me, I've got a car." They bundled into his black SUV, Beth cradling Lena in the back seat, James gripping the wheel tighter than he needed to. Rain hammered against the windscreen, but his focus was absolute. The hospital wasn't far, but every red light felt like a betrayal. In the rearview mirror, he saw Beth whispering softly to her daughter, her voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. At the ER, he parked and opened the door for them, holding the umbrella awkwardly as they rushed inside. Beth handled the paperwork with trembling hands. James sat beside her, waiting as the nurse led Lena away for tests. He hated hospitals. Too many cold memories, too many sterile corridors. But he didn't leave. Not even when the hours stretched long, not when the vending machine coffee turned bitter in his mouth. He stayed. Lena was eventually settled into a narrow hospital bed, a small IV in her arm, her tiny face pale against the white pillow. Beth sat on one side, her head bowed. James sat on the other, silent for a long time before reaching for the child's hand. He wrapped his fingers around hers, warm and still. Then he began to speak, voice low and steady. Not about business or markets or stocks, but about a princess who could turn sadness into flowers, and a knight who didn't fight with swords but with kindness and patience. Beth said nothing, but her eyes glistened. She didn't stop him. Lena fell asleep listening to his made-up tale. James didn't check his phone. He didn't think about the client emails piling up or the meetings he'd missed. He just stayed. And as he watched Lena sleep, he realized something staggering. He didn't feel out of place here. He didn't feel burdened or awkward. He felt right. Beth exhaled deeply, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. She looked across the bed at him. This man who had once been a stranger in a navy suit, now holding her daughter's hand like she was his own. There was no trace of pity in his eyes, only tenderness. "You didn't have to do all this," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." Beth didn't respond with words. She just nodded slowly and leaned back into her chair, watching Lena breathe, watching James sit so still, so present. It was a kind of presence she wasn't used to. Most men in her life had vanished at the first sign of trouble. James hadn't. He had shown up in the rain and stayed through the fear. Later that night, after the nurse had dimmed the lights and checked Lena's vitals one last time, Beth stepped out into the corridor. James followed. The hallway was quiet, painted in muted tones that tried and failed to make the place feel welcoming. Beth leaned against the wall, arms folded tightly. "I don't know what this is," she said without looking at him. "I don't either," James replied, "but I know it matters." She turned her head slightly, studying him. "I'm not trying to be a hero," he added. I care about both of you." Beth's eyes softened. "That's what scares me." He didn't push her. He didn't try to make promises. He just nodded. "It scares me too." They stood there in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not dramatically, but quietly, deeply. Trust. Not yet love, but the beginning of it. The raw, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was willing to stay. Not out of obligation, not out of charity, but out of choice. When they returned to the room, Lena stirred slightly, her hand searching the space beside her. Without a word, James sat back down and took her hand again. Her fingers curled around his, her breathing steadied. Beth didn't cry. She was too used to being the strong one. But her hand brushed briefly across James's shoulder as she passed him. A silent thank you, a fragile kind of acceptance. It wasn't dramatic. There were no declarations, no grand gestures. Just one man, one woman, and a child asleep in a hospital bed. But in that quiet room, beneath the low hum of machines and the sound of rain still tapping at the windows, something real was being built. Not loudly, but honestly. And that, James thought, might be the most important kind of love there is. Love doesn't always arrive in fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it slips in quietly, through a hand reaching for yours across a blanket in the park, or the weight of a sleepy child resting her head against your arm. That was how it unfolded for James. Not as a whirlwind romance, but as a slow, steady becoming. He hadn't set out to become anyone's family. In fact, he'd lived most of his life with emotional armor, convinced that success and solitude were safer than risking anything soft. But standing beside Beth in that backyard, watching Lena twirl in a crown made of paper stars, he realized something profound. He didn't feel like a visitor in their world anymore. He felt like he belonged, and that belonging didn't come from money or grand gestures. It came from presence, from showing up again and again in ways that mattered, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He read bedtime stories. He made Saturday pancakes shaped like animals, even if they looked more like abstract art. He sat quietly with Beth when she didn't have the words and never asked her to explain the tiredness in her eyes. That was love. Real love. The kind that doesn't flinch in the face of reality. The kind that stays even when it rains, even when it's inconvenient, even when there are no guarantees. Beth, too, had grown used to being let down. People came and went. Promises were made and broken so often that she stopped listening to them. But James didn't promise. He just stayed. He held Lena's hand through hospital visits. He listened to Beth's silence without trying to fix it. And in doing so, he offered something more powerful than any spoken vow: consistency. And that changed everything. The lesson here isn't about finding someone who checks every box. It's about recognizing that the deepest kind of love isn't perfect. It's persistent. It's made of ordinary moments lived with extraordinary care. It's two people building a life not with diamonds and declarations, but with crayons, shared meals, and small acts of everyday bravery. So if you're reading this, whether you're a single mom holding everything together with tired hands or someone who's lost more than they've dared to admit, please know this: you are not broken for wanting someone to stay, and you are not weak for needing to be held. Real love doesn't see those needs as burdens. It sees them as doors, invitations, pathways into something sacred. And to anyone who's on the other side, someone who's afraid to care too much, afraid they'll mess it all up, remember this: love isn't about perfection. It's about presence. Just showing up matters. Just listening matters. You matter. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is to sit beside someone in the quiet and say, "I'm not leaving." If this story moved you, if it reminded you of what truly matters in a world obsessed with speed and surface, please leave us a comment below. Share your story. Let someone else reading know they're not alone. And if you believe in stories that soften hearts and spark hope, we invite you to subscribe to our channel.